Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm, and today we actually have a lot to do, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the preamble. This is how our project looked toward the end of last week, and I want to make sure that we all understand what we're doing here. We have our main level. Our character is going to be inside the level here, and we're going to be able to run around and jump. And today we're focused on building our player character, our player controller. So the first thing we need is, obviously, we need a sprite for our character. So I'm going to open up my assets folder here, and I'm going to bring in my player sprite sheet. And for this sprite sheet, we're going to set all the settings properly. It's a multiple because there's multiple sprites within it. 32 pixels per unit. And turn off the filter and turn off the compression. We'll hit apply. And then we'll go into the sprite editor. I'll hit slice. I'm going to change it to grid by cell size, 32 by 32, and I'll hit slice and apply. Okay, now what we need to do is we're going to create a series of animations. The first two frames here are my idle animation. The second two frames are my running animation, and the last two frames are my jump animation. So here's how we're going to create those. I'm going to click on the first sprite, hold Shift. I just turned on caps lock. Hold Shift and click on my second sprite. Now they're both selected. So when I drag these out into the scene view, Unity is going to automatically assume I'm creating a new animation, which is correct. That's what I'm going to do. But I don't want it here in this folder. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it animation or animations or whatever, and I'm going to put it in there. And then I want to change my new animation. I want to change the name. I'm going to call it idle, and click save. I'm going to do the same thing for my run animation. Select them both, bring it out, put it in animations, call it run, and save. And then I'll do the same thing for my jump animation. Put it in animations, call it jump, and save. Okay, now notice we have three characters now on the screen. We don't need all of them, right? We only need this first one, the first one we created, player_0. So I can delete these two and get rid of them. And I'm going to rename this to player because that's going to be my main character. This is the main player of my game. All right. Now let's take a look inside the animations folder. Notice that we have our idle animation, our jump animation, and our run animation, but we also have three animator controllers in here. Notice that our player is using player_0 as its animator controller. These other two we don't actually need, so we can delete those as well. So delete and delete. Okay, now we have everything we need to set up our animations. To do that, we're going to need the animator window. If you do not see the animator tab up here, you can go to Window, Animation, and Animator. Okay. Now, this can be a bit difficult to navigate through, but luckily we don't have too much that we need to do in this area. We just need to tie our animations together. And luckily, the idle animation is on by default. It has this orange color, which means it's our default animation. But we need to bring the other two in here. Let's bring jump in, and let's bring in run. Now, in order to move from idle to, let's say, run, we're going to need something called a transition. That transition is going to be something that tells our idle animation that it's done, and it needs to change to the run animation. These transitions are controlled by parameters, okay? Now the parameters that we're going to use, because this is a very simple animator controller, we can use Boolean parameters. Basically, are we running? Are we not running? Are we jumping? Are we not jumping? So I'm going to create a Boolean parameter, and I'm going to call this isRunning. And let's create another Boolean parameter called isJumping. Okay, perfect. So now we have the parameters we need. We just need to actually create the logic for our animation system here. So from idle to run, in order to make that transition, I'm going to right click on idle, click make transition, and click on run. Now notice that I have this little line here with the arrow saying I'm going from idle to run. If I click on the arrow, then I have the settings for that transition. First, I want to uncheck has exit time because we don't want this animation to continue to run after I've already transitioned. And then in conditions, I'm going to click this little plus box here. And it says is running is true. So if we're in idle and then is running changes to true, we're going to transition to run. That's exactly what we're looking for. Now to go back from run to idle, because let's say we stop running, we want to actually stop, we can create another transition, turn off has exit time, and is running is going to just change to false. It's that easy. Now to go from idle to jump, we want to turn off has exit time. And instead of is running, we're going to use is jumping is true. And if is jumping is true, then we are going to jump. Let's make a transition back to idle. Let's turn off has exit time. And let's think about the logic here. If I'm in a jump state, I could come down from my jump either in idle or run. And it's going to be confusing to know which one I need to come down into. So I'm going to need both parameters here. First of all, I'm going to need to set is jumping to false because we don't want to transition away from jumping until we're not jumping. But I also, for idle, I want to turn is running off as well. I want to say if is running is false and is jumping is false, then we go back to idle. To go from run to jump, it's simply turn off has exit time and is jumping true. Then from jump to run, we need to turn off has exit time. We need to set is running to true, but is jumping to false. Perfect. So that is our entire animator controller system. Now there's one other thing you may want to take a look at. If we go to, let's go to my scene view and let's hit play. Notice that my idle animation is very, very fast, right? I may want to turn that down a little bit because it does look a bit quick. So the way you want to do that is go into your animator and click on your animation itself. There's a speed option here. I'm going to turn mine down to 0.5, and I'm actually going to do that for all of my animations. And you can play around with that speed and tweak it and all that stuff and make sure it all works. Now let me show you how this kind of works here. So if I hit play, I have my idle animation, which looks pretty good now. If I turn it to running, if I turn on this Boolean, then it'll transition to the running animation. If I turn on jumping, it'll transition to the jumping animation. If I turn them both on, then it'll transition to jumping. So this is actually working exactly the way we want it to. Perfect. Alrighty. So next we have to go back into our player and make sure he has all the other components that are required for this thing to work. So one of the components is going to be obviously a rigid body 2D because we want this character to move around in physical space. So rigid body 2D. I'm going to keep the gravity scale to 1. Normally we've always turned it off, but this game requires gravity because we're going to be doing some jumping. So I'm going to leave it at 1. We're probably going to change it later just to fine tune our jumping and how it feels. But for right now, I'm going to keep it at 1. One thing I do want to do is I want to turn off rotation on the Z-axis because I don't want him like flipping around when he hits a bump in the road. All right, another component we're going to need is a collider. So I'm just going to use a circle collider 2D. And let's go in and edit the collider a little bit so that it's, I want it to just be right there on the wheel. That looks fine. I'm okay with that. Just shrink it just a little bit. What else? We could, yeah, I'm not going to get into that yet. There's some other things that we're going to do here later when we get into jumping, but I'm not going to worry about that yet. What I do want to do is I need a script because this controller or this player is ready to start being programmed. So I'm going to go into my assets folder, create a new folder, call it scripts, enter. And then inside my scripts, inside my scripts folder, I'm going to create a new script. I'll call it character controller. Now this can be, you can name it whatever you want. Hello. Reload. Sure. Okay, I don't know what that's doing. Let's give that a second while that loads. All right, and let's see. Let's close that out. Let's add this to my player character. So now I have my character controller script. It's added, and let's go ahead and open it up in Visual Studio. Okay, perfect. So now we have our player controller script, or our character controller script. It's ready to go. First thing we have to do is account for the variables that we're going to need. Let's think about it. We're going to need a movement speed. So a public float, we'll call this move speed, equals, let's set it to 10 for now, and we can change that if we want. The other variable we're going to need for this movement is we want something that handles how much we are going to slide. Sliding is, in a 2D platforming game, there's a small amount of movement after you've stopped moving, a little bit of sliding that happens. We want to add some sliding into the game. Now, we could do it as just a regular float, make it public, we could put in the number we want. But there's an interesting way to do it that I want to show you something new. We can create public variables that instead of just putting in text, we can have a slider that we can slide back and forth by creating something called a range. This range is going to be between 0 and 1. And then we can say public float sliding. And we'll set it to say 0.9f to start. Now if I were to go into Unity, let's save this and click on our player object here. Notice that down here I have a sliding. I have a sliding bar that I can slide back and forth. This will help us to fine-tune the amount of sliding we want after we've stopped running. So this is going to help us fine-tune the feel of our running and make it a little bit more useful for user feedback. Okay, and I think that's really all we're going to need in terms of movement variables. The other thing we're going to want is we want a reference to our rigid body 2D. We're going to call this player. And we also want a reference to our animator. And we're going to call this player anim. Okay. So let's grab those references in the start method. Player equals get component rigid body 2D and player anim equals get component animator. Okay, perfect. So now we have everything that we need in order to start moving our character around. So in our update method, first we're going to need to get our input on the horizontal axis. So we'll say float h equals input.getAxis raw, and it's going to be horizontal. Then we want to get a reference to our current velocity right now. So we'll say v equals player.velocity. Now I know normally in our other scripts v was our vertical, but we actually want to handle vertical with a jump, with a force that we apply. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get a reference to our current velocity so that we can change that velocity once we stop. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So let's say if we are not standing still, so h would be 0 if we're not moving at all. Let's say if we're not standing still, if we're moving in any direction, either negative or positive direction, then we want to change our running, or we want to change our animation to running, and we want to change our velocity, right? So there's an easy way to do this. Let's say if h does not equal 0, then player anim dot set bool. This is going to change that parameter, that is running parameter, to be true. So basically turn on that checkbox that I showed you just a minute ago. Then we want to change the velocity of our player to equal a new vector2. Our horizontal is going to be h times, h times move speed. And our vertical is just going to be v dot y, whatever our current vertical axis y value is. All right. So that's if we're moving. Now, if we're not moving, so if h is 0, then player dot, actually, I can just copy and paste. Let's do that. So these two lines here are just going to be the opposite. So is running, did I put is runner? Is running. Okay. Is running is false. And instead of h times move speed, it's actually going to be v dot x, so whatever our horizontal velocity is right now, times sliding. So what this is going to do is this is going to slow down our velocity gradually instead of making it happen automatically. All right, now the last thing we need to do is we need to flip our sprite if they're facing in the wrong direction. So let's take a look here in Unity and I'll show you what I mean. So here in the player sprite renderer component, we have this option to flip the X or Y. So if we click flip X, then it basically flips our sprite on the horizontal axis. Okay, so what we can do is in our script, we can say if h is greater than 0, then we are going to get component. Now we probably could have created a reference to this, but whatever. We'll just grab it here. Flip X equals true. So we're turning on flip X if we're going back, or if we're, no, we want that less than, sorry. So if it's less than 0, then flip X will be true. Meaning if we're going backward, we're going to flip around. And then with this, we can really just copy and paste and say if h is greater than 0, then flip X will be false. It's that easy. Now we have basic movement. Let's go ahead and attach this to Unity and come back over here, and we will see that we have our stuff here. It's ready to go. Everything good. All right, let's go ahead and play. So notice my idle animation works when I run. My running animation kicks in, and I can flip my character back and forth pretty easily without. Now notice that when I stop, I'm sliding just a little bit. It's probably hard to tell because you can't see exactly when I'm releasing the key. But when you play around with it yourself, you'll see. Now, the higher this number is, the less slidey you're going to get. So the lower the number is, the less slidey you're going to get. The higher it is, the more slide you're going to get. See that? it just slides right off. So if you have like an icy thing, that feels pretty good. Okay, cool. So my movement is working. Now we need to get into jumping. Now this is going to be a bit complicated, so I want to explain it, but the video's getting kind of long. We're past 20 minutes now. So I don't want to get too crazy with the explanation. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create an object that always rests right underneath the player. And whenever that object collides with a collider, then we're going to say, hey, you can jump. Whenever that object isn't colliding with a collider, then we're going to turn off your ability to jump, right? That's essentially what we're going to do. So on our player object, let's right click and let's create an empty. And we will rename this, let's call it ground check. This is going to be an object that exists only to check whether or not we can move. And what we want is we want that ground check object to be right on the bottom of our character. Let's go right about there. Yeah, I'm trying to fine tune it because it has to be pretty accurate. Okay, so we have a ground check object here. Now over in our script, we need to add a couple of new variables. First, we need our jump force. So this is going to be a public float. We'll call it jump force equals 1200. Now we're going to fine tune this. We're going to play around with it in a minute. Then we want a Boolean that checks to see if we are grounded or not. Is grounded. We'll set it to false to begin with. Then we want what's called a layer mask. We want to check to see if we're on the layer called ground. Some of our layers are not going to be jumpable, like we don't want to jump on them. So I'm going to change let's say public layer mask, and we'll call this ground layer. Okay. We also want the position of that ground check. So public transform ground check collider. And let's create a float called ground check radius. Okay, we're going to need all of these variables here in a minute. And the other thing we're going to do is let's create a private, up here in our private variables, let's create a private circle collider 2D player col. We're just creating a reference to the player's collider. So player col equals get component circle collider 2D. Okay. All of this will make sense, hopefully, in just a moment. All right. So first thing we need to do is we need to create a new method. So we'll go underneath the update method. We need to create a new method called ground check. And this is going to handle checking to see if we are grounded. We're going to set is grounded to false right away. And then we're only going to change it if something is colliding. So we'll say collider 2D. We're going to create an array of the colliders we're going to create an array of colliders within the game. Physics 2D overlap circle all ground check collider dot position ground check radius ground layer. Okay, so that looks very complicated. Basically, this is just looking for any colliders that are interacting with that ground check. They're checking to see if anything's overlapping, right? And then we'll say if colliders.length is bigger than 0. Basically, if we found any, colliders. colliders.length. If we found any colliders that are overlapping with that circle, then we're going to change is grounded to true. Okay, so that method is going to check to see if we're grounded. So up here in our update method, let's go ahead and run the ground check method each frame so that we know. And we'll say if input.get button down is jump, so whatever is your button for jumping, and is grounded, then player anim dot set bool is jumping will set to true. Yeah. And then player dot add force. This is where we're actually going to apply the jumping force to our character. Vector2 dot up times jump force. Okay. So that's if we are grounded and we've pressed the jump button. Else, we want to basically set the jumping Boolean to false. Okay. Now, believe it or not, that's all of the code that we need to write for this player controller, at least so far. We'll go ahead and do that and then hit stop. Now, when we come in here and look at our player, notice we have a bunch of stuff that we really need to focus on. First, we need to make the ground layer something, right? The ground layer has to be set. So let's go to the grid that has our collider on it. Let's go to layer and let's say add layer. Let's go to an empty layer and call it ground. Okay. Click on that grid again, go into layer and set it to the ground layer. And yes, change children. Okay. Now when we come over to player, we can go down and set the ground layer to ground. Next, we want to grab the check collider. We'll bring that in and drop that right in, that ground check object. And we want to set the radius to something really small, maybe like 0.2, maybe 0.5. Okay. Let's test this. If we've done everything correctly, we should be able, oh gosh, to jump, which we can, but there's something wrong with our jump force and our gravity. I'm going to change gravity to 10 and see if that feels better. And it kind of does, but it makes my player a little bit sluggish. So maybe turn my jump force down. Let's set gravity scale to 5 and change my jump force to maybe 600 instead. Okay. Maybe a little bit more, 1,000. Anyway, so you're going to have to fine tune what makes sense for your jump. Notice that I cannot double jump though, which is exactly what I want. I do not want to double jump. There is an issue here though. Notice I'm sticking to the edge of the screen. There's a very quick way for us to fix that. Let's do it before we get too far. Inside my tile or my grid, my ground grid here, I'm going to create, let's create a new folder. We'll call this materials. If I create a physics 2D material, physics material 2D, I'll call it slip, sure. And I change that to friction is 0, bounciness is 0. What that's going to do is it's going to create, or it's going to allow me to apply this to my collider. And it's going to make it so that there's no friction between my character and the game and the ground itself. So if I jump on the wall, notice that I just come right back down. Okay. And I'm still, I didn't reset the, I changed my options or my stuff in here, but I didn't change it outside of play mode. All right, so that feels about right. I now have a player that can run around the screen and jump, and you're going to want to spend some time playing around with your jumping. Okay. All right, so that's about it. 30 minutes is enough for a video. I'm going to go ahead and cut it there. Like I said, we had a lot to do today, and we got through it. So I'll see you guys next week when we add in a camera follow system and our parallax. All right.